Hello and welcome to this video which will form part of our work on the topic which is number 4, the field as social. I'm talking about, of course, the field of international relations or international politics, also known as world politics. The idea of the field as social is important. This is a move in opposition to customary ways of thinking about the field within the academy, the mainstream academy. Because whether it's stated explicitly or not, the field is understood as something out there, and the researcher is able to stand outside and look at it objectively, at least even if these scholars don't believe that the researcher really is outside society. They believe that the researcher can and should stand outside in the sense of maintaining a kind of objective distance. So it's important to understand that the approaches we're going to talk about as being a challenge to those kinds of epistemological or knowledge assumptions. And I'm calling this video Representing Everything. It's a good title because it emphasizes the centrality of representation to the approaches we're going to be talking about, and it's a point that's often lost. It's often lost in assumptions that are made about the supposed linguistic turn in social sciences, the importance of text, the idea of discourse, and these ideas about what's entailed in a broadly constructivist approach to social science can be a little bit misleading. Now, when I was putting together the idea for this class and choosing this image, what I thought was that this would be kind of spooky, this Google Maps image looking at where we are, because I thought we'd be sitting in classroom in this building, and this sort of slightly uncomfortable feeling of standing outside ourselves, like a kind of out-of-body experience. The point about doing that is to say something about the idea of reflexivity, the idea of self-consciousness to the point of a good deal of uncertainty about things we, as subjects in Western society, things we've been accustomed to taking for granted. One of the things is the whole idea of the self, a kind of metaphysical idea rooted in ideas like those of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. But the sense of the possibility of a sort of reflexivity, a switching to a different point of perspective and seeing your own experiences and what happens from a different point of view. This is something, I think it's fair to say, something that has become more common, and it's associated with ideas that we could call broadly post-structuralist. A good illustration of the whole issue is what's at stake in the representation of the self. As long as you work with some kind of metaphysical concept of a continuous and coherent self, this doesn't really enter the field. But if you think that the self and its existence is really something that we represent, in a sense, to ourselves, and who others represent to us, the way in which that notion of continuous and coherent selfhood is actually made of a kind of narrative which constitutes that continuity, that sense of a coherent connection between our earlier and our later experiences that is unified under the idea of the self. The idea of the self is something we collectively represent, and which may even also be a source of conflict. What kind of identity we take on, what kind of identity we're able to define for ourselves, whether it's Trump defining himself as statesman-like, as a very brainy man, for example, or the way in which that identity is represented by others. So representation in this sense is also a way of thinking about agency, not agency something assumed to be autonomous and which proceeds unproblematically according to individual conceptions and goals, but rather agency is operating in a kind of social field, using the resources of representation and constitution at our disposal, and working in the context of other perspectives and other ways of representing the world and its subjects. So it's very important actually to think about some key concepts that are favoured by post-structuralists, and one of those is the idea of the Speech Act, closely related to the idea that has become almost a kind of platitude, it's become so common, is to talk about discourse. Both these concepts, if you reflect upon what they mean, both these concepts illustrate a very important point about post-structuralism that I think is going to be at the center of our discussion, that it's not just about a realm of language and abstract constitution of ideas and events. It's about embodied practice. It's about relationships of power. How do I stake out a sense of who I am in a social field in relation to others? This is a very important point about this approach, because it's an approach that's rooted in a certain critical perspective on society and the interaction of real human beings.